Cash smelled like dirty pennies and cheap hair oil. $100,000 sat stacked on a collapsing card table, shivering every time the floorboards groaned under a 500-pound giant. 7 seconds. That was the wager. Nobody thought a man built like a whippet could survive 3. He ended it. Neon buzzed through the frosted glass of the basement gym, casting a sickly, jaundiced glow over the canvas. Alec Porter hated that sound. It was a high, persistent whine that drilled directly into the space behind his eyes, aggravating a hangover that had been slowly crystallizing since Tuesday. He pressed 2 thick fingers against his temples, trying to massage away the throb, but the floor shook again. Thud. A heavy leather punching bag, wrapped in duct tape and smelling faintly of mildew and dried vomit, swung wildly on its rusted steel chain. Thud. Alec flinched. The man hitting the bag didn't belong in a boxing gym. Hank Dempsey was an anomaly of human genetics, a grotesque mountain of meat, bone, and bad intentions. 512 pounds, weighed that very morning on a freight scale down at the meatpacking district. He wasn't soft either. Hank carried his weight like a deep-sea creature built to withstand crushing pressure. His shoulders sloped up into his ears, burying his neck beneath slabs of trap muscle that looked like tumorous growths under his pale, pockmarked skin. Hank delivered another right hook. The heavy bag groaned, the chain screaming against its anchor in the ceiling joists. Fine particles of dried plaster drifted down from the ceiling like a dirty snowfall, coating the slick resin-stained canvas below. 7 seconds, Hank rumbled. His voice didn't come from his throat. It vibrated out of his massive chest, wet and congested. He hawked a wad of phlegm onto the floorboards, leaving a thick, glistening stain near the ring apron. That's all I'm asking. 7 seconds in the box with me. Alec looked down at the folding table in front of him. The stacks of $100 bills were bound in tight rubber bands, smelling of banking ink and the stale cigar smoke of the loan sharks who had fronted the cash. $100,000. In 1970, it was enough money to buy a neighborhood, or at least disappear into a better class of misery. It was a freak show. Alec knew it. He was a cynical man who made his living skimming percentages off broken noses and fractured ribs, but even he felt a greasy sickness in his gut about this. Hank had been traveling the underground circuit for 6 months, offering this absurd wager. The rules were primal. Step onto the mat. Survive 7 seconds without being pinned, knocked unconscious, or thrown through the ropes. No one had made it past 5. Hank didn't just beat men, he dismantled them. He used his sheer mass to trap oxygen in their lungs until they panicked, snapping collarbones under his knees, smothering them in a fleshy, suffocating darkness. Alec had seen a promising middleweight leave the ring 3 weeks ago with a detached retina and 3 crushed ribs. The gym door rattled open. A gust of cold Los Angeles night air swept in, carrying the harsh smell of vehicle exhaust and wet asphalt, momentarily cutting through the gym's native musk of ammonia, wintergreen rubbing alcohol, and old sweat. Alec looked up. The man who walked in didn't carry himself like a fighter looking for a payday. He was average height, dressed in a sharp, dark wool jacket over a simple white t-shirt. His dark hair was neatly styled, but his face carried an undeniable exhaustion. Bruce Lee rubbed the back of his neck, rotating his head until a sharp, audible pop echoed in the sudden quiet of the gym. He looked annoyed, not intimidated, just profoundly, deeply irritated, like a man who had realized he was standing in the wrong line at the bank. Hank stopped hitting the bag. He turned slowly, his chest heaving. Sweat rolled down the deep creases of his torso, catching the yellow light. He stared at the newcomer, letting out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together underwater. Bruce didn't look at the giant right away. He looked at the floor, noting the sticky patches of spit and resin. He looked at the rusted turnbuckles. Finally, his dark, calculating eyes settled on the folding table, taking in the neat stacks of cash and Alec's clammy, miserable face behind them. "You're the promoter," Bruce said. His voice was clipped. It wasn't the philosophical, airy tone people expected from martial arts instructors. It was sharp, grounded, holding a distinctly American cadence layered over his Hong Kong roots. Alec swallowed, shifting his weight on the metal folding chair. It squeaked in protest. "I hold the money, yeah." "And the rules?" Bruce asked, taking 2 steps forward. His shoes made virtually no sound. Hank barked a laugh, stepping away from the bag. He wiped his face with a towel that looked like a washcloth in his massive ham-hocked hands. "Rules are simple, China Doll. You stay on your feet for 7 seconds. You don't tap, you don't sleep, you walk away with the bag." Bruce looked at Hank. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't sneer. He simply analyzed the mass in front of him with the cold, detached precision of an engineer inspecting a structurally compromised bridge. He saw the way Hank favored his left knee, slightly dragging the foot. He noticed the heavy, wet breathing, a cardiovascular system pushed to the absolute brink just by keeping that massive frame alive. "I heard you hurt a kid in Oakland last week," Bruce said quietly. "Broke his arm after the bell." Hank tossed the towel onto the ropes. It slapped wetly against the canvas. Kid shouldn't have been in the water if he couldn't swim. Bruce reached up and unbuttoned his wool jacket. He didn't do it with dramatic flair. His movements were functional, economic. He was tired. His lower back ached from a long drive, and he was hungry. He hated spectacles. He hated the crude, brutish bastardization of combat that men like Hank Dempsey represented. 7 seconds, Bruce repeated, folding his jacket and placing it meticulously on a wooden bench near the door. He turned back, his white t-shirt clinging slightly to a physique that looked like braided steel wire under tension. "Let's make it 3. Silence fell over the gym, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street above and the frantic, rhythmic ticking of Alec's wristwatch. Alec let out a harsh, involuntary breath. "Listen, buddy," he rasped, finding his voice. "I don't know who you think you are, but this ain't a movie. This guy is 500 pounds. He will literally crush you. I ain't looking to catch a manslaughter charge because you got a death wish." 3 seconds, Bruce repeated, ignoring Alec completely. His eyes remained locked on Hank. "If I am not standing over you in 3 seconds, you keep the money." Hank's face, usually an unreadable slab of aggressive apathy, twitched. The skin around his small, piggy eyes darkened into an angry, mottled purple. It wasn't just an insult. It was a physical impossibility. Hank weighed more than 3 times what Bruce did. Gravity alone dictated the outcome of this interaction. "You arrogant little shit," Hank spat. He stepped onto the ring apron, the heavy wooden planks groaning under his foot. He ducked through the ropes, bringing the sour, overwhelming stench of unwashed body and stale adrenaline into the center of the ring. "I'm gonna snap your spine." Bruce didn't bother using the stairs. He placed one hand lightly on the top rope and vaulted over it in a single, fluid motion. It was so casual, it bordered on insulting. He landed perfectly balanced, the rubber soles of his thin canvas shoes squeaking sharply against the mat. The air in the ring was stifling. Under the harsh lights, the temperature was a good 10 degrees hotter than the rest of the room. Bruce rolled his shoulders. He felt a slight pinch in his left deltoid, a remnant of a bad sparring session the week before. He acknowledged the pain, categorized it, and mentally walled it off. Perfection wasn't the absence of pain. It was the refusal to let it dictate the outcome. He stood in the center of the ring. He didn't adopt a wide, cinematic fighting stance. Instead, he stood almost naturally, his right side slightly forward, his hands resting loosely near his hips. Hank moved forward. For a man of his immense size, he wasn't entirely slow. He had the terrifying, rumbling momentum of a runaway freight train. He didn't bother putting his hands up to defend his face. Why would he? Bruce's fists looked like delicate porcelain compared to the thick, dense bone of Hank's skull. Hank's strategy was simple. Close the distance, absorb whatever pitiful strike the small man threw, grab a hold of him, and let gravity and mass do the rest. "Clock it, Alec," Hank growled, not taking his eyes off Bruce. Alec's hands were shaking. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulling out a heavy chrome mechanical stopwatch. The metal felt ice cold against his sweating palm. He clicked the top button once to reset it, his thumb hovering nervously over the trigger. Bruce breathed in through his nose. The smell of the gym faded. The buzzing of the neon light faded. The cynical, fearful energy radiating from Alec melted away. In Bruce's mind, the ring transformed from a filthy basement enclosure into a sterile grid of angles, distances, and vectors. Hank wasn't a monster. He was a physics problem. 500 pounds meant immense kinetic energy, but it also meant catastrophic inertia. A body that massive could not change direction once committed. It could not mask its telegraphing. Bruce watched Hank's heavy, flat feet. He watched the subtle shift in the giant's massive hips. He listened to the wet, dragging intake of breath. "Whenever you're ready, big man," Bruce said softly. Hank roared. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a guttural explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged forward. The canvas buckled violently, rippling like a disturbed pond beneath his massive footfalls. He threw his arms wide, a sprawling, fleshy net designed to envelop Bruce completely. "Go!" Alec yelled, his thumb slamming down on the stopwatch. Click. 1. Hank's shadow swallowed Bruce. The giant's massive arms, thick as oak trunks, closed in a crushing embrace. If they connected, Bruce's ribs would splinter like dry kindling. But Bruce wasn't there. He didn't leap backward. He didn't try to run away from the mass. In a display of counterintuitive brilliance, Bruce stepped into the danger. He dropped his center of gravity dangerously low, his right foot sliding forward just inches from Hank's planted, dragging left knee. The air displaced by Hank's missed bear hug ruffled Bruce's hair. Hank's momentum carried him violently forward, his massive frame suddenly encountering empty space where a human body was supposed to be. 2. Bruce didn't look at Hank's face. He didn't aim for the jaw. A punch to the head of a 500-pound man would only break the puncher's hand. Bruce aimed for the structural flaw he had noticed the moment he walked into the room. Hank's left leg, bearing the full catastrophic weight of his forward lunge, was hyperextended. Bruce pivoted. His hips torqued with the violent coiled snap of a steel spring releasing. All of his 135 pounds, multiplied by the velocity of his rotation, channeled into the heel of his right foot. He drove a vicious, unyielding sidekick directly into the side of Hank's left knee joint. The sound was sickening. It didn't sound like a clean break. It sounded like wet canvas tearing, followed by the dull, hollow crack of a thick tree branch snapping under immense pressure. Hank's forward momentum, combined with the sudden catastrophic failure of his primary support pillar, resulted in a horrific collapse. The giant's mouth opened in a silent "oh" of shock as his left leg buckled inward at a completely unnatural, grotesque angle. 3. Gravity claimed its prize. Hank Dempsey didn't just fall. He crashed. 500 pounds of dead weight slammed onto the resin-stained canvas with a concussive force that rattled Alec's teeth. The ring ropes shook violently, snapping back and forth. Dust exploded from the mat in a gray cloud. Hank hit the floor face first, a terrible, breathless grunt escaping his lungs as all the air was violently forced out of his massive chest. He lay there, twitching, his ruined leg bent sideways beneath him, clutching the canvas in blind, suffocating agony. Alec stood frozen, his thumb still pressed hard against the metal crown of the stopwatch. He stared down at the dial. The thin black needle hovered perfectly over the 3-second mark. Bruce stood exactly where he had been a moment ago, breathing evenly through his nose. He looked down at his canvas shoe, adjusting it slightly with a faint look of annoyance, as if he had stepped in something unpleasant. The silence in the gym was absolute, save for the wet, gasping wheezes of the giant writhing on the floor. Alec Porter forgot how to breathe. He stood entirely paralyzed behind the folding table, his thumb welded to the crown of the chrome stopwatch. The thin black needle was frozen with mocking precision directly over the number 3. He stared at the dial, waiting for it to tick forward, waiting for the mechanical reality of the watch to correct the impossible hallucination he had just witnessed. It did not move. Hank Dempsey sounded like a drowning engine. The giant lay face down on the sticky canvas, his massive hands clawing frantically at the resin-stained floorboards, tearing up thick strips of white athletic tape in a blind, suffocating panic. The human nervous system possesses a merciful built-in delay for catastrophic trauma, but that grace period was rapidly expiring. Hank tried to push his torso up. As he shifted his immense weight, his left leg flopped with a sickening loose heaviness. It was a grotesque appendage now, no longer a structural pillar connected by taut ligaments and mechanical joints, but a ruined sack of torn tissue and fat dragging uselessly behind his hip. When the visual reality of his severed mobility reached his brain, Hank let out a sound that Alec would never forget. It wasn't a roar. It was a high, thin, whistling shriek that was profoundly disturbing coming from a chest that broad. Bruce Lee did not raise his hands in victory. He did not puff out his chest or look at the fallen giant with anything resembling triumph. He simply let out a slow, controlled exhale through his nose. Standing in the center of the ring, Bruce reached down and pressed two knuckles deeply into his right hip flexor. The torque required to generate that much kinetic energy in a fraction of a second carried a heavy physical tax. A sharp, burning ache radiated down his sciatic nerve, wrapping around his lower back. Physics demanded an equal and opposite reaction. Driving a concentrated heel strike through a joint that was actively supporting 500 pounds meant Bruce's own skeletal structure had absorbed a violent, jarring shock wave. He frowned, irritated with himself. It had been sloppy. He had aimed for the exact center of the patella to force a clean backwards dislocation, but Hank's dragging step had shifted the target by half an inch. Bruce had been forced to strike the lateral collateral ligament instead, tearing the knee sideways. It worked, but it was not mathematically perfect. Perfection was a ghost. Bruce chased to the point of utter exhaustion, and tonight he had compromised. A dark, spreading stain began to seep into the gray cotton of Hank's sweatpants. His bladder had let go from the sheer shock of the trauma. The sharp, pungent smell of ammonia rose up from the canvas, mingling violently with the gym's native stench of old wintergreen and stale cigar smoke. Alec finally snapped out of his catatonia. He dropped the stopwatch. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack, the glass face shattering, freezing the 3-second verdict permanently. Alec scrambled up from the folding chair, the metal leg scraping a harsh, grating screech across the floor. He didn't rush to the ring to help his fighter. Hank was ruined meat now. A terrible liability. Alec backed up until his shoulder blades hit the cinder block wall, his eyes darting frantically toward the stacks of $100 bills. He slipped, Alec stammered. His voice cracked, sounding like dry leaves crushing underfoot. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at the ring apron. The floor was wet. He lost his footing. That doesn't count. Bruce turned his head slowly. The cold, deadpan stare he leveled at the promoter stripped the remaining oxygen right out of the basement. He didn't yell. He didn't adopt a fighting stance. He just looked at Alec with the weary, detached irritation of a man forced to explain basic arithmetic to a stubborn child. "Count it," Bruce said. 2 words, flat, devoid of ego, but carrying the dense, crushing weight of an absolute verdict. Alec's eyes darted toward the battered metal desk sitting in the shadows near the office door. Bruce tracked the micro-movement instantly. He saw the slight shift in Alec's shoulders, the sudden calculation in the promoter's panicked eyes. A gun. There was a firearm in that desk. It was the predictable, cowardly math of the underground fight circuit. "If you move toward that desk," Bruce stated, his voice barely above a whisper but cutting through Hank's ongoing sobbing like a razor blade, "I will not hit your knee." Alec froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray under the buzzing neon tube. He looked at the shattered giant on the canvas, then back to the small, calm man standing amidst the destruction. Alec raised his hands, palms out, in a frantic gesture of surrender. Okay, man, Jesus," Alec rasped, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stumbled toward the folding table, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over a stack of bills. The paper money scattered across the dirty card table, reeking of banking ink and corrupt intent. Bruce walked to the edge of the ring. He gripped the top rope, testing its tension, and stepped cleanly through the cables. He lowered himself to the concrete floor, deliberately masking the slight nagging limp in his right leg. He walked over to the wooden bench near the door, picked up his sharply tailored dark wool jacket and slipped it on. He buttoned it with meticulous care, the crisp fabric hiding the tense, coiled muscles of his shoulders. Alec found a faded green canvas duffel bag crumpled under the table. He snatched it up and began throwing the money inside. He didn't bother organizing the stacks. He just shoveled them in, desperate to finalize the transaction and remove this terrifying anomaly from his gym. "You don't understand who put this paper up," Alec muttered, his voice a frantic wet whisper as he zipped the heavy canvas bag shut. The metal teeth caught on a frayed thread, and Alec yanked it violently, tearing the fabric. "These guys, they don't just write off $100 grand. You walk out of here with this bag. You don't just walk into the sunset. They will find you." Bruce stepped up to the table. He didn't look at Alec. He looked at the heavy, lumpy canvas bag. "I understand exactly who put it up," Bruce replied softly, "and I know how they operate. They value investments that pay dividends." He gestured slightly toward the ring, where Hank was now curled into a massive, shivering fetal position, clutching his ruined leg. "Your giant is a bad investment. Tell your backers they backed a structural failure." Bruce reached out and grabbed the thick webbed handles of the duffel bag. He pulled it off the table. It was heavy. It felt like holding a cinder block. The metal crash bar of the gym's exit door was rusted and cold against Bruce's palm. He pushed it open, stepping out of the stagnant, ammonia-choked basement and into the damp, smog-heavy air of the Los Angeles night. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him with a resonant, booming thud, instantly cutting off the pathetic, wet sounds of Hank Dempsey's agony. Nighttime in this industrial sector of the city smelled like rotting citrus rinds, hot asphalt, and diesel exhaust. Bruce stood in the narrow alleyway for a moment, letting the cool air hit his face. He breathed in deeply, holding the polluted air in his lungs for 3 seconds before pushing it out. The canvas bag thumped rhythmically against his thigh as he walked toward the street. The adrenaline, which had been a tightly controlled cold trickle during the brief encounter, was beginning to fully metabolize. It left behind a hollow, jittery sensation deep in his gut. His hands felt entirely steady, but his internal organs felt as though they were vibrating at a low, uncomfortable frequency. He reached his car, a modest dark sedan parked under the flickering amber glow of a street lamp. He pulled his keys from his jacket pocket, unlocked the trunk, and tossed the duffel bag inside. The heavy thud of the cash hitting the spare tire cover reverberated through the quiet street. Bruce stared down at the bag for a long moment before slamming the lid shut. People thought fighting was glorious. They sat in darkened movie theaters, watching stylized choreography and wirework, believing that combat was a noble ballet of honor, spiritual enlightenment, and righteous victory. It was a comfortable, profitable lie. Real violence was what he had just left behind in that basement. It was a filthy room, a crippled giant lying in his own bodily fluids, and a terrified middleman shoveling dirty money into a gym bag. It was biomechanics and cruelty. Bruce slid into the driver's seat, the stiff vinyl creaking under his weight. The interior of the car smelled faintly of worn leather and the stale, cold coffee he had abandoned in the center console hours earlier. He inserted the key into the ignition, but did not turn it. He sat in the suffocating darkness of the cabin, listening to the metallic ticking of the cooling engine block. He hated the hypocrisy that twisted inside his own chest. He sought profound philosophical truth through the study of motion. He wanted to elevate martial arts to a science of human expression, a method of stripping away the inessential to find absolute honesty. Yet, the world only respected the brutal, undeniable geometry of a shattered kneecap. He had needed capital to fund his schools, to maintain his independence from the predatory studio executives in Hollywood, and to carve his own path. To get that capital, He had been forced to stoop to the level of a crude underground spectacle. He raised his right hand in the dim amber light filtering through the windshield. He stared at his knuckles. The skin was perfectly smooth, unblemished, untouched. He had dismantled a 500-pound monster without throwing a single punch. It was the absolute, terrifying embodiment of his own philosophy. Minimum effort, maximum efficiency, striking the void instead of the mass. Yet, the victory felt incredibly cheap. There was no honor in fighting a man who relied entirely on intimidation and unearned mass. Hank Dempsey was not a martial artist. He was a bully, a crude instrument of blunt force trauma who preyed on the fear of weaker men. Defeating him proved nothing about Bruce's own spiritual or technical journey. It merely proved that physics was an impartial, unforgiving judge. Gravity simply does not care how much a man weighs when his primary support structure is violently removed. Bruce reached down and dug his thumb aggressively into his right thigh. The muscle near his hip flexor was seizing, tightening into a dense, painful knot. He pressed his thumb deeper into the tissue, his jaw clenching as a sharp spike of pain shot up his spine, forcing the muscle fibers to mechanically release their tension. He had to be perfect tomorrow. He had eager students relying on him. He had an entire ancient industry to disrupt. He could not afford to carry the physical limp or the heavy mental baggage of this basement brawl into the daylight. He turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally settled into a low, steady idle that vibrated through the steering wheel. He shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the grimy brick facade of the underground gym disappearing in his rearview mirror. The streets of Los Angeles rolled past his window, a blurred, lonely mosaic of red taillights, glowing neon liquor store signs, and deep-shadowed concrete expanses. He drove mechanically, his mind refusing to rest. He replayed the geometry of the fight over and over in his head. He analyzed his own micro-movements, searching ruthlessly for the slight, microscopic inefficiency in his pivot that had caused the unnecessary strain in his hip. He was his own harshest critic, an absolute tyrant of biomechanics. By the time he reached the freeway on-ramp, the sprawling metropolis was settling into its deep night rhythm. The radio played a low, crackling jazz tune, a chaotic, improvised jumble of brass and brushed percussion that perfectly mirrored the conflicting, tangled emotions in his chest. He reached over and turned the volume down until the music was barely a whisper. He drove into the suffocating darkness of the highway. He had $100,000 in the trunk. He had a slight, nagging limp in his right leg, and he carried a profound, lingering exhaustion at a cynical world that only seemed to understand the blunt, ugly language of violence. If this raw, unfiltered look at the reality of combat resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more grounded storytelling. We do not do Hollywood myths here. We explore the gritty biomechanical truths of martial arts history. Share this video with someone who appreciates the heavy, imperfect reality behind the legends. Drop a comment below on what you thought of this breakdown, and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive.